All right, so we're going to jump right in. I'm not gonna do a lot of introduction. We're going to talk about Second Timothy. I love Second Timothy. I was just telling some of the guys here why that I did a lot of memorization in Second Timothy. Love it because as an evangelist, there are three books, First and Second Timothy and Titus, that are written to evangelists. And they, if you've ever been in the ministry, they speak to what you do. And so I've gone back and I've studied particularly Second Timothy, and you're going to understand the reason why when we jump into this. I don't know. I try not sometimes to do this. Sometimes I go, my favorite book is, and I think if I said in the Old Testament, it's probably Ecclesiastes. But in the New Testament, Second Timothy is going to be right at the top. So I'm excited about doing this. Thank you guys for being here. I know it's Thursday night. I know I was with some of you guys at midweek last night. And I'm really grateful for that. There is a wealth of information in First and Second Timothy and Titus. Chronologically, it probably goes First Timothy, Titus, Second Timothy. And not that we're going to get technical at all, but just for fun and for free tonight, if I had to date what is going on here, and I would start with Paul's first imprisonment in Rome. Remember that from the book of Acts. We believe, and there's much discussion about this, so I'm just throwing something at you for fun. This is not what we're going to do in this class. This class is going to be super practical. And I think you'll see that in just a few minutes. But if I had to guess, I would say Paul arrived in Rome in AD 59, his first time. Remember, he had his first imprisonment. And if we follow what the book of Acts says, there's a belief that he got out. And remember, it says for 2 whole years. And so I would put Paul then back in prison, or the end of the first imprisonment in 61. He does additional ministry, and then his second imprisonment is sometime around 64, and he stays in prison and then eventually dies. Okay? Don't know if that helps you at all in your mind to go, okay, I know kind of where we are in the New Testament with when the church began and Paul, and a lot of these writings were before the Gospels were actually recorded, not before they happened, but before they were recorded. Okay. A great way, Gary's a step ahead here, but a great way, not just to read a chapter, but a great way when you're studying a book, particularly a shorter book, is to read the whole book as it was, which is, it was a what? Letter. So how do you read a letter? You start at the beginning, you go to the end. Now tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different, but there's a reason for doing that. And one of the things I love about just reading it one time through is you get a big sense of what you're going to look at. But when you go to Second Timothy, I think it's a little bit different. Now, one of the things I love about Second Timothy is it is just a for real book. If you've ever lived a day in the ministry, you read through this and you go, I know why Paul's saying that. I get it. And that's why I think it's so encouraging to so many folks that have been in the ministry, is that you see the reality. You see some bad things happen. You see good things happen. And that's one of the reasons I love it. But now, so if I follow my own reasoning, and remember, this is a letter, right? And so Timothy, who was in Ephesus at the time, both First and Second Timothy were written to Timothy while he was taking care of the church in Ephesus. Paul is in a Roman prison. We actually got to visit a site where they believe Paul was held in chains, and Peter as well. And it's, you think prison, don't think think dungeon, okay? Cold, dank, barely see the light of day, ugly, And that'll have a lot to do with some of the things that we read in here. So Paul's going to write this letter to Timothy, his son in the faith. He's written him one time, right? First Timothy, given him a lot of instruction in First Timothy, a lot of encouragement. Know you're young, but do this, do this, do this. And Second Timothy has a little bit of that, but it's got a different tone to it. And the reason it has a different tone to it is where I want to go first. So Timothy picks up this letter and he starts writing it. If I can just peruse through it, in chapter 1, come on, Timothy, be faithful. There's a lot going on in the world. Number 2, chapter 2, we got to do a really good job. And we're going to spend half of one of our nights talking about passing the faith to the next generation. And that's one of the things Paul has on his heart at that time. And Timothy's his guy. And so, come on, Timothy, you got to do that. And then in the rest of chapter 2, he gets some really specific stuff, but I think there's a reason for it. Where he talks about things like who you should be. And several different times he's going to talk about quarreling and arguing and things that just come out in people. And he's telling Timothy what to do about that. Again, I think it's all going to make sense in just a minute. Flee the youthful. Don't get involved in stupid arguments, etc. Then he goes to chapter 3, which I think is the resume of America. Okay. In the last days, there will be terrible times. And then he describes those people. And then he says to Timothy, you, however, you're different. That's what comes next. And then he gives, scripture we all know, stay with the Bible. And then he starts chapter 4. And you'll hear chapter 4 again on Sunday as we appoint a new evangelist. Excited about that. In the presence of God, preach the word. Okay. And so Timothy's reading this and he's got to be going, this is awesome. Paul believes in me. There's such a positive. Yeah, there's terrible times, but look at what he's told me to do. This is great. And then, in my opinion, the letter comes to a screeching halt. And I think Timothy would have gone, what did you just say? For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time has come for my departure. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who long for his appearing. Put yourself in Timothy's position. This is your mentor. This is the guy that's been helping you and encouraging you. And he writes you this letter and somebody delivered it and you're reading it. And you get to almost the end of the letter and he tells you this massive thing. Hey, dude, I'm this close to death and it's coming. That's why I'm starting here. Because if you don't get that, you don't get the letter of 2 Timothy. It is Paul's final words. And we don't get that until, so I didn't want to go to like week 4 because it is the climax not only of this letter, it's the climax of his ministry and the climax of his life. And so I got to believe Timothy sat down and went, Paul really believes, and we think it really did happen. There's some discrepancies about dating and when Paul was actually killed. Most scholars believe it did happen. And so I think it's good for us to start right there. Now, what I want you to do for a minute is ask yourself this question. See, this is what a practical study of the books of the Bible. So now, Paul knows he's about to die. I don't know how many of us are going to know that. Sometimes we get a diagnosis and we kind of know it's coming, and sometimes it's the Mack truck, we just don't know. Paul knew it. So here's my question to you. And I want I want you, well, we're going to do this two ways. Number one, we're going to say, so if you were Paul, what do you think would be on your mind? You kind of know his story, right? You know all Paul went through and all in his life and all in his ministry. He knows he's about to die and he's writing his son in the faith. Right? Put yourself in that situation first. If you're Paul, tell me some things you might want to say or do or write about, or what would be on your heart and mind? Okay. Sure. You got to encourage him, as his father in the faith. This is going to be difficult. We're going to talk in a minute about his appeal to come see him, but we don't know if that ever happened or not. Okay.
Yeah, no, one thing I think about, he'd already said it in another letter, that Philippians, that he was torn between the two.
There you go.
So, and he would rather depart and be with Christ, but he knew he was going to stay for the progress and joy of other disciples. I think he felt that even more with Timothy.
Yes. And that is about to be proven to be true in verse 6, which is coming up. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's stay on our question for a minute. What would you write? Because that's going to help you understand the book of 2 Timothy, because that's what Paul is doing. He's saying, this is my last shot, Timothy. And so I'm writing to you. And doesn't that put a perspective on things that as you go back to chapter 1 and 2 and 3, if you've got that in mind, things are going to jump off the page at you in a way you go, I never thought of it that way, because we're now understanding why Paul is writing this book. All right, what else? Okay.
I think it's reading that because it's the come, so he's giving encouragement, hope, and just reminding them that what I told you in the first letter, now it's about Titus 1 and leave you with these comforting words for you to fix your eyes, so we'll take your eyes off of that spot.
Great. Awesome. All right, great one. Yeah. Yes. All right. Sure. Sure.
I just think about sometimes kids I don't know, we think about preparing her. It seems like no matter how much I feel I've prepared my kids, I always feel like
Yeah.
there's so much more.
Absolutely.
I don't know, I just feel like I keep getting it.
Yeah. So can't you see Paul sitting in a dark prison trying to write this out and going, like, what do I say to him? Well, I want to start, so I'm not going to start with the big news. Okay. I'm going to wait a minute. I want to start by encouraging him. Okay. Some of this stuff begins to really, because these are just letters. They're real men in real situations. Sometimes I think we over spiritualize and forget Paul's just a man like us, and he's writing to his buddy, and he's about to die, and he's doing what you and I would do. So let me now take this the next step, and this might be homework because I got to keep moving here. Okay, go ahead before I go on. Okay. Okay. Yes. And we're going to come back to your word intentional in just a minute, because I believe there's something intentional going on here that I think we just skip right over. We'll get to that. All right. So here's maybe a homework for you. And you don't have to go do this. It's more of a thought process for you. If you want to do it, do it. But what if this were you about to die? What are the things you would want to pass on? You know, we're going to ask this question in week 2 or 3, 2 Timothy 2:2. Who's your Timothy? And what would you want to say to him or her? But I think it's a good thing for us to stop a moment and go, you know, if I were about to die and I were going to pen some words, what would I write? One question is, if I got into the mind of Paul, what would I want to do? But now let's take this thing personal. And I think if there's a message that screams out of 2 Timothy is, write your own. What would you want to say? So here's what Paul does say. We're going to dissect 3 verses and then we're going to do something together right after that. He says, for I am already. So this is something is happening in Rome and Paul knows it and he knows the end is near. And he says, I'm already being poured out like a drink offering and the time has come for my departure. Let's break that down. The drink offering is probably for sure a reference to the way the Romans did what they call a libation drink at the end of a meal. And it was poured out in celebration. And what is Paul saying? My life is being poured out as a sacrifice to God. It's already happening. But then I love the thought of this next one. We're going to camp out here just a minute. And the time has come for my departure. Now, this is one of the reasons that I love to do word studies. The word here is analusis, that is translated departure. And there's some great pictures of this. All right. How many of you have ever been camping? Did you put up a tent? And in most tents, now before they came up with a lot of the fancy sticks now that bend nice for you, what do you do on the corners? You stake it, and then what's between it? A rope, right? Okay. That is the word that's used right here. What he's saying is, I'm taking my tent and it's being untied. And what do you do when you untie the tent? You fold it up, you close it down. The other way this word is used is for a mooring. So you take a boat, you put it up to a dock, and what do? Analusis, you tie it off, but then the untying it. Can you get that picture? Paul is being very poetic here. I mean, you can tell he's thinking about this. And basically what he's saying is, I'm untying and how do we say it? I'm setting off into the wild blue yonder. Now, we might ought to stop right there and ask ourselves this question. If I'm writing my letter, is that how I'm going to describe my death? Gary hit on it a while ago when he says, it is far better for me to depart and be with God, but I'm going to stay here. I know that's what God's put on my heart. But for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And he goes to describe his death, and he's describing it by saying, you know what? I'm ready to just untie this thing, close the tent up and go, or I'm going to take my ship and I'm going to sail out into the ocean. I'm gone. I think there's a lot of study need to be done right here on how Paul viewed death. I'm not sure as disciples I don't find a hint, even when Paul's describing this in any of his books, where he's like, oh, this death thing's freaking me out, man. He writes about it in such a positive way. Every time he writes about it, we will not all sleep, but in the moment of twinkling of an eye. Oh my goodness, it's always hopeful. It's always encouraging. It's graduation day. Not this, we all dread it. And I'm not saying Paul never had any fear. That's a natural human response. But when I read this, I go, That's an interesting way to describe getting executed in a Roman prison. I think I would have said, I'm about to get my head chopped off. It's scary. It's not what Paul does. So I think that's a good place for us to stop and ponder and go, what is my view of death? How do I look at it? It's a great pause when you're studying and you come across something like that. Okay, he keeps going and he says, I have fought the good fight. The word there, you ever heard me preach? You know, it's one of my favorite word studies. The word is agon in Greek, where we get our word agonize, or agonizomai is one of the words that I preached many times, where Paul talks about the guy running to the end of the race, running such a way as to get the prize. He uses this word, agonizomai. You're just straining to what is ahead. And he says, you know what? I've done that. I have fought the good fight. In other words, I have given it my best. Boy, what a great thing to be able to say at the end of your life, isn't it? You know what? I didn't do everything perfect. Oh, and I had my failures, but doggone, I gave my best. You know, that is one of the things about playing sports that I like. And I played, baseball through college. And if you can walk off the field and say, I gave my best, even win or lose, it feels better to win. And we know what Paul's about to say. But even when you lose, and you lose to a good team, you can walk over, shake their hand, you can walk off the field proud and say, I did my best. But can you imagine what we'll feel if on our deathbed we're going, now I'm sure we can all say, I could have done more. Of course. But I'm talking about summarizing your life. And you go, man, I just didn't give God the best. I don't think that's what we want to say. And that's what Paul's saying. I did it, and I have kept the faith. Paul says, and by the way, let me back up. I want to say this. Paul says, I finished the race. I gotta believe Paul has the games in mind. And I gotta think he's got the marathoners in mind. Because life is a marathon, isn't it? It's tough sometimes. I've never run one, don't intend to. But I know this from talking to people. You get to about mile 20. And that's where you start finding out who you are and what you're made of. And I think what Paul's saying here is, I finished the marathon. I finished the race. There a good number of gray hairs in here. Sadly enough, probably for any one of us sitting here that has a few gray hairs or no hair, we know folks that haven't finished the race. They've quit the race. They went to mile 20. They were doing it a long time, maybe even in the ministry a long time, and they're not walking with God. And we've got to be determined to finish. I've kept the faith. I was true to the words that I said when I said Jesus is Lord. I've done it. Okay. And then verse 8. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness with the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me. What an encouragement to us. Do you have that confidence? So those three verses right there, to me, are the climax of Paul's life. That's Paul saying, I'm here at the end. I've fought the fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. Here's my confidence. And if there's something we need to get out of 2 Timothy, that's it right there in my book. That is the apex. That is the climax of this book. Now, when we go back and start looking at other stuff, we got to put it in that context. We'll do an activity with that here in just a second. You use the word intentional while ago. So Paul is just, given the climax of his life. You would think there'd be nothing else to say. I have given you my best shot. I've given you my heart. I've given you what I believe in. Here you go, Timothy. Life's over. Signed, Paul. But there's a bunch of verses after that. And I call these what I call, and you've heard me say it before, throwaway verses. Don't take that the wrong way, but I think that's the way we treat them many times. Is we go, oh, it's personal remarks. It's just some greetings. It's just a couple of goodbyes. I don't think that's what follows. You wouldn't, write a letter to somebody dear to you and go, by the way, I'm dying. And I got a few words to say about that and my faith in God and this. And by the way, I'm going to leave you this recipe and, the key to my tool shed out back. It must mean that what Paul shares here might be so much more valuable and so much more insightful about his life if we'd slow down long enough to go, why are these? And we're going to read them right now. Let me see how I'm doing them. All right, come on. Do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and bring my scrolls, especially the parchments. Alexander, the metalworker, did a great deal of harm. The Lord will repay him for what he has done. You too should be on your guard against him, because he has strongly opposed our message. At my first defense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. May it not be held against them. But the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen. Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus stayed in Corinth, and I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. Do your best to get here before winter. Eubulus greets you. So do Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers. The Lord be with you. Grace be with you. So I'm going to have to give Lynn some credit here. Lynn and I actually did a lesson for the leaders of our new region, and we took it from these verses right here. Because his verses we tend to just skip over and go, oh, that was nice, Paul. Thanks for saying that. But I believe what Paul is doing is he's opening up his heart. How? At the end of his life. And he's telling us, if you read in the lines, what matters to you. And how he got to where he got to be able to say what we just read. I have fought the good fight. I've finished. I've kept. There's a crown. Let me tell you how I did it. That's what I think he's doing. And boy, if you come with that, there are some things that start to jump off the page. Paul, how did you make it through? Do you remember well, I'll get to that in a minute. Let's don't go read it right now. But I'm going to try to get through 4 or 5 things here that I think if we would stop for a minute, we would find out something about Paul that we watch him doing or he's telling us he's doing. Okay, let's go to let's just start with an easy one. Verse 9. Do your best to come to me quickly. Paul's writing to Timothy. He says, Timothy, get here. And then later he gets more specific in verse 21. Do your best to get here before winter. All right, let's stop for a minute. Let's talk about that. What do you think Paul is doing there? What? Okay, but why the urgency? Okay. Broader. Go ahead. No. Okay. So that's practical. We'll get to that in a second.
And giving him a mission also.
Okay.
Something for him to feel, he's.
Okay, that could very well be a part of it. But what about a personal level for Paul? Why does he want Timothy there? There you go. You know what I think this teaches? And then he says very specific at the end, think about this phrase. You know, these are it's one of those phrases we just skip right over. Do your best to come before winter. Why? It's bad enough that I'm in a prison, but winters in a Roman prison are cold, dark, discouraging. I need you here. Paul asked for help. So one of the things we learn about it, and you go back, and we're going to touch on this in a minute in Romans 16, but think about all the people that helped him in his ministry. How good are we? To me, one of the keys to making it to the end is that we know when to ask for help. Paul was down. He was hurting. He was in a prison. We've already read this. You know, almost everybody but Luke deserted him. He's lonely. And so what is he doing? He's reaching out and asking for help. And how many people have you seen walk away from God because they won't ask for help? They're not close enough to people to go, hey, bro, sister, I'm struggling here. Can you help me? Can you come? And by the way, come before winter. I don't think I'll make it through a winter. Now, I don't know if it meant I'll freeze to death, or I'm just so down, or I don't think, the Roman government's going to give me that long. I don't know. But we read those verses and we go, why are they in the Bible? I think it's an insight into Paul. So there's one. Now, in all of these, I hope you'll ask the question, how good am I at that? If I want to make it to the end, do I get help in my life? And do I ask for it? Instead of waiting for people to come and go, bro, you need some help. Okay. Second thing, there are, and I'm going to run through some of these. There are 14 people mentioned in those verses we just read. There are 36 people. I preached on it 2-3 Sundays ago when I talked about Romans 16, about the other kinds of leaders. And again, we always look at Romans 16 and say, oh, that's Paul greeting all of his friends. No, it's not. It's Paul telling you who the leaders of that church in Rome were. These are his partners. Think of the words that he used. Come on, help me. Romans 16. They risked their lives for me. She was a mother to me. They've done so much for you and for me. They're tested and approved in the Lord. They're my relatives. What is Paul saying? This is my partnership. You don't make it on your own. You make it with great partners. And so right here at the end, he's doing two things. He's talking about the difficulty of partners that have left, because that hurts. Is that real to anybody?
Yeah.
You ever dealt with that? Whew, that's tough stuff. But it also says to me, Paul was a team player. It's teamwork, not independence. I'm the Apostle Paul. And we talked about this when we talked about Acts 15, when they were going for the great question there, at the Council of Jerusalem. Paul could have put his foot down and gone, doggone it, I'm an apostle. I don't need to go ask nobody. But you see that great sense of partnership. It's tough when partners go away. You know, going through it right now. Watching Sam Lang wither away. Doesn't know me anymore. Oh, if he's got his notepad out, he's got notes, but that's hard. Brad Bynum, one of my, I guess, our first disciplers, outrunning and dropped dead of a heart attack. One of the most fit, in shape people, just boom, gone. You can imagine what Timothy is going to feel in this. But you can imagine what Paul's going through when all these people have deserted him. And he's there alone with Luke, good old Luke, stuck with him the whole time. We got to replace those partnerships with new ones. You know, I spent time today with Dave Piker, one of my partners in the gospel, and we're forming other partnerships with other folks that are just near and dear partners, the Claytons, the Teds, the Kyles. These are your partners. And you go through life together with them. The ups, the downs, they see you at your best, they see you at your worst. And Paul's calling those people by name right here. It's an insight. That is something you would do at the end of your life, isn't it? You go, my buddies that have gotten me through. Luke's here with me. Timothy, you, and Paul names them, and I think that's the same thing he's doing in Romans 16. You know what? You're going to need them. Yeah. Everybody needs partners. And if you want to be able to say what Paul says, you need to read about his partnerships. Greet Priscilla and Aquila. What a dynamic couple and what they were to Paul. But Paul, so what do your partnerships look like? How deep are they? Who would sail to come see you before winter and go through what it was going to take to get there? Wow, those better be some deep partnerships. All right, third thing I see here. So y'all remember, we probably don't have time to read it right now. What is this thing saying? Oh no, I meant there was a caution on the screen, but are y'all still there on the screen?
Yes.
All right, thanks, Oliver. Appreciate it. So you remember 2 Corinthians 11 when Paul says, I've been in danger of my countrymen, and you got to follow what he's doing there. He's not bragging. He's trying to make a case for something. List out all the things he says, and I've been shipwrecked. What else? Beaten many times.
Stoned, left for dead.
Stoned, left for dead. Hunger. A night and a day in the open sea. Anybody ever been, thrown into the sea and you swim for, this guy, and then what his own people tried to do to him, in danger for my own countrymen. And you remember that big long list. I don't think I need to remind you all of that. And then we come to this passage right here, and we have Demas, one of the guys that was with him, that deserts him because he loved this world. Oh boy. We ought to pray every day, God, keep the worldliness out of our lives.
Yeah.
And he's calling attention to that. And he talks about Alexander and boy, I tell you what, people come after you. And it's tough. And I'll guarantee you, if you live more than a few days in the ministry, or you live for a few more days as a family group leader, somebody's going to come after you. Somebody's going to get on your case. Somebody's going to make it like, well, I'm just trying to help. So Paul had all that. We are flawed. We have our weaknesses. We see weaknesses in others, and we see weaknesses in ourselves. Read with me verse 16. At my first defense, what happens in a Roman court is you get what we would call a first appearance, a first, you get to go and kind of, and he says, no one came to me for support. Stop right there. You're Paul. You got your resume over here. It's this long of all the things people have done to you. All the things you've been through in your life. You're getting down to the end of your life, and all you need is somebody to come and be your paraclete. Speak for you. Say something in your defense and in your behalf. Be there to encourage me. Just anything. And nary a person showed up. I am going to slam my Bible shut. I'm going to walk out the door, and I'm done with you people. Is that what Paul said? What's the next thing out of his mouth? May it not be held. Oh my goodness. Remember when he talked about some preach Christ out of envy, and he goes, you know what? But Christ is preached. It's not about me. Here's what I call that. I call that dealing with disappointments without souring. You stay around God's kingdom long enough, you're going to see disappointment after disappointment. I've lived them. I've done them. I've been on both ends of that coin. I'm sure some people, as they lay abed at night, they go, that Rick Overturf hadn't done that to me, you know, blah, 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 blah. And I could do the same thing. Here's the question for us. Here's what I see Paul at the end of his life. Wouldn't it have been easy for Paul to be bitter? And of kind of, as we would call it, which you know I hate this word if you've heard me speak much at all, bent it a little bit and gone, I'm going to call a few of you by name. Good night. Why couldn't you get here? Lord, may it not be held. I think we're getting an insight into a man that could go to his grave going, I got no bitterness in my heart. I'm good. No, I wish somebody had been there. You know, I'm human. But I got no bitterness. That's what Paul's saying there. He's living it. If we just see it off the page and go, no wonder he was able to get there. Because I'll tell you, see to it that no one misses the grace of God in a bitter root. Because that's what'll kill our faith, is a bitter root. How you doing with that? You've had disappointments. You've had people hurt you. You've done it too, by the way. Don't forget that part. But if you let it build up, Paul hadn't. And I think that's why Paul had so much confidence. Number whatever, 4, I guess it is. I'm always intrigued by this one, and I've always tried to, think, why did Paul add, verse 13, when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas. Okay, I can understand that one fairly well. If you're in a cold, dark prison, cloak was think of it as like a tunic. It's a big, heavy thing, and they just cut a hole and you pull it over your head and it drapes down and it keeps you warm. Well, winter's, I get that. But notice what he says next. And my scrolls, especially the parchments. Why, Paul? You're about to die. What do you need with probably the Old Testament scriptures? And we think, remember, it's 2 things, scrolls and parchments written on different kinds of material, probably maybe a copy of the Old Testament, and maybe some of the early writings of the New Testament that people had been writing down for Paul. Remember, he said, see what large, letters I use because I'm writing with my own hand. He's telling us I didn't write most of this stuff. We think because his eyesight was so bad because of getting beaten all the time. He had a amanuensis, a secretary. Perhaps it's some of those writings that have been recorded. We don't know for sure. Why do you think he's asking for those things? Encouragement, okay. But if Timothy is the one that has them and is going to bring them, okay, tell me about that. What do you mean?
Just so he doesn't lose focus himself.
Okay. So go back here. Here's a hint. Look at chapter 4, verse 1. What is he talking about? Right before he says, I'm about to die. All the false teachers, Time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they'll gather around them a great number of teachers to say, he's talking about doctrine. I think it is just his love of the scriptures. And he wanted them next to him when he dies. They were special to him. That's how much he cherished truth, God's word. And he said, Timothy, bring those with you. They weren't going to do him a whole lot of good, were they? I think this was him opening up and just saying, these are things that I treasure, and I want the word of God by my side. Because it's what's gotten me through my whole life. Might be sentimentality. That's okay. It meant something to Paul. My granddad was a minister for, I don't know how many years. My dad, by the way, preached on Sunday. He's 93. My granddad is buried with his preaching Bible in his hands. That's the way we wanted it as a family, because that's who he was. He had most of the New Testament memorized. So I remember as a kid watching my granddad preach, and he held that little Bible. I would say it's a little bit bigger than this. And he held it when he preached, but he never opened it. He didn't need to. Because that's how well he knew his Bible. And in those days, they preached for at least for an hour. And their sermons were full of scripture. Full of scripture. And it was just quote one right after the other. Had a guy come, maybe one of the best sermons I ever heard. Getting his name, Alonzo Welch, I believe it was. Came and spoke in an audience on a Sunday night when I was in college. And there were probably 1,500 people. The place was packed, Henderson. And he stood up to preach. And he started way over in the Old Testament. He didn't say, hello, good evening. My name is so-and-so. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting. Not a word. He stood up with a Bible in hand, but never opened it. And about 50 minutes later, he had taken the Bible and told the story of Jesus from beginning to end, and finished with, come, all you are heavy laden, and I will give you rest, and sat down. Most amazing sermon, all about scripture. That's the feel and the flavor of what I get right here when Paul says, bring me my parchments. Bring me the scrolls. I want them with me. Do we love our Bibles that much? Is that what I would be asking for? Again, an insight into his life. Seems like just this little request, but then if you stop for a minute and go, why is he asking for that? Maybe you go, because that's a man that lived the scriptures. Remember, he's the one that told Timothy in his first book, all scripture is God breathed. You begin to get this idea of who Paul was. And then I think the last one I'm going to at least hit. So we go to verse 11. And you got another story to get this. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful in my ministry. Now, if you don't know the backstory, that doesn't seem a whole like much, right? Remember the big blowout he had with Barnabas? Who was that over? Mark. And he gets here at the end, he goes, bring him with you. He could be helpful. I call that just a man of grace. He was able to forgive, put it past people, and was able to use Mark. And by the way, we're glad he did that, right? Because Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. Thank you. You look in verse 16 and that humility that he had with his brothers, and then the very last words penned of Paul on the face of the earth. Grace be with you. It was his life. Oh, but for the grace of God, I am what I am, yet it was not me, but the grace of God that was in me. Paul lived grace. At the end of his life, the last word he's going to leave the earth with is, grace be with you. Why? Because he needed it. And he lived it. Now, take those pictures and you go, wow, this chapter 4 is chock full of a lot, isn't it? It is the book itself. It is telling us who Paul is. It is saying, this is my heart. This is who I am. This is how I've gotten here. And that is going to help us then as we go back and start seeing some of the things you go, now I get why Paul, when we see what Demas did, it makes sense what he was doing here. And that's why I went to chapter 4 tonight. Sorry, Gary. Gary was being such a studious guy. He listened to chapter 1 over and over, thinking we would just go to chapter 1. But now I hope you understand why we did it. To go, wow, this is a book that if we would just dig ourselves into it, it could be such an encouragement to us. And I think that's why he wrote it to Timothy. We've talked about that. This was written to encourage Timothy because Paul knew what was going to happen. And he needed some encouragement himself. I don't know where you are, but I hope this encourages you to dig into this book and to go, okay, I want to know this book, because you got to figure the last words of a man as great as Paul was, they'd be worth deeply studying. And that's what I want us to do the other 3 times we have together. All right. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Let me see, where am I at on time? Oh man, 8 o'clock on the dot. I mean, I'm not bragging or anything, but that's good right there. It might be. Let's see, what's that worse about a humility? Any just brief casual thoughts?
I have a thought. I think it's, to me, it's, right after he talked about everyone deserted him, 17, no one came to my support, but the Lord stood at my side. So,
Yeah.
and again, I think even that is, he's speaking to Timothy because Paul knows what he's getting ready to go through.
Yeah.
And he wants him to know the Lord will stand by your side.
Right.
And he will give you the strength. And he's sharing, again, he's opening up the heart. What a strength that he had in the Lord and his faith in him.
And you know where that I think is practical for the church today and for us as well? You're going to get to a point where you think you're on your own. You think I'm the only one here. And it's at that point, you better know God is with you, or you'll quit, or you'll stop. And I've watched people and seen it. Watch people go, the church disappointed me. People in the church disappointed me. Okay. We're human. That's going to happen. God is by your side. Don't quit the church. Don't quit God. And that's, I mean, I think that's a great point, Gary, of, you know, all Paul went through, he knew God was still there. And so he loved God's church and God's people as much the last day as he did, you know, those other days. Great. Any other thoughts,
I
Lynn?
wonder, I think about something you said, made me think about how much he must have thought about the road to Damascus in those 3 days that he sat in darkness, and how if he had responded differently, how the end of his life would have been so different. He probably would have been filled with regret, remorse for the lives he had taken. You know, who knows? But he wouldn't have had that
Yeah.
peace and that kind of grace if he had chosen different.
says a lot about the last words people speak and the last conversations they have. You'll find out what's in their heart. Are they at peace? It's going to come out. And that's to me what those last verses are. And I hope that inspires us that when we come across things like Romans 16, we don't just go, oh, it's just Paul's friends and he's just saying hello. There's got to be a reason God put it in the Bible. That there's got to be a deeper meaning. Now I know I can't guarantee you the 5 things that we looked at, but I guarantee you they're demonstrative of Paul's life. Whether that's exactly what Paul had in mind, it might have just been coming out of his pores and him not even know why. Talking about his friends or reaching out and say, come to me before winter. That seems to have a little more intentionality about it. And I really appreciated your word earlier because I think there's a lot of intentionality in the last few verses, but it's kind of easy sometimes to read, I fought the good fight, and then just go, oh yeah, and that stuff. And I'm encouraging you to dig deeper. Jim?
One of the things that got my attention was my first offense, one of the things that I support. There's so much of how we are in the justice system here that are based on
Yep.
the Roman system
Roman law.
and prior to that. Well, if you're a little bit familiar with our system, my first offense is the same as our first appearance.
Yep.
And if you have somebody there that's on your behalf and everything, you can actually get out of jail because they post a bond or
Exactly.
the keeper of the jail or the magistrate lowers your bond to the point where you just get out and walk out.
Yeah.
And so to have Paul had somebody there, that may have happened.
Right. Right. That's a great point, Jim. Appreciate that. All right. Are you guys online able to hear people's questions or comments pretty well? Yes, no, it varies on the group. Okay. We'll work on this better for subsequent weeks, but, okay. Well, I want to, let's just stop right there. Okay. Hopefully this has encouraged you to dig deeper, excites you about studying 1 Timothy. We probably will. Well, actually, we're not going to do chapter by chapter. We're going to go grab themes. Why does Paul talk so much about this? Why this? Now, related to tonight, that should be a little bit easier to figure out what's on his heart and mind. Like, for instance, one of the things, false teachers. Good night. I mean, he's going to spend a chunk, and he's already done it in 1 Timothy. We might ought to take note of that and us step back in our world today. So that's the way we're going to do this. Tonight was, let's figure out who Paul was and what made him tick. And then the other weeks, we're going to grab some subjects. So you may want to, like I said, read the whole thing because we're going to jump around a little bit. All right. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.